There was this old hiking trail way out in the woods off a ridge that my aunt and uncle lived on. It wasn't even like an official trail or anything like that. It's just that ever since anyone could remember, there was always a walkway through the woods that grass never grew over for whatever reason. We live in one of the most rural areas in the country, so we were always careful not to travel too far, out of fear of getting lost, of course. I bring that up because I'm not sure why we hadn't realized before that we always just stayed on the trail. If we just followed along it, it would be pretty impossible for us to get lost at all. When I brought that up to my cousin, it was like he had this monumental facepalm realization moment. We made a plan to take a few days and try and see just how far this old trail actually went, maybe map out the area a bit. We grabbed some supplies to hold us over, because we expected to camp out for at least one night. If it didn't take us more than one night, we'd probably just camp out anyway. We set out pretty early in the morning. My cousin Jim and I were the ones going along. As I mentioned, it was a long trail. We had been decently far out on it. I think it was probably around 4 or 5 o'clock when we passed the furthest point we'd ever been before. The trail just kind of went on, and by the time it was dark, we knew we'd have to set up camp for at least one night. We put up our tent, and it was really pretty fun. Our sense of adventure was really peaked now. We stayed up late at night talking and wondering what we would come across the next day. When we woke up the next morning, my cousin told me he hadn't slept very great the night before. I asked him why, and he told me he thought he'd heard someone walking around our campsite. I reminded him that we were way out in the woods, and there were lots of animals around anyway. Best not to let his imagination run away. With this said, he seemed to relax a bit. As we got up for the day at around noon or so, we noticed something really strange up ahead of us, yet off the trail a slight ways. As we got closer, we realized it was one of those small silver Airstream trailers. It was really old, and we assumed it was abandoned. We went up to it. I wanted to take a closer look and maybe go inside. Jim didn't want to have anything to do with this. He kept telling me that I didn't live in the country and didn't know there were still people who lived way out in the hills like this. I didn't care though. I was positive it was abandoned. I told him I would knock on the door first at least. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer. I knocked again and again. Still no answer. I grabbed for the door latch with Jim protesting the entire time. I pulled up the latch and was immediately hit with a nasty smell. I stepped up into the extremely hot trailer. It was a tiny one-room affair. Against one wall was a makeshift kitchen and a counter. The near wall had a bench on it where there was a tiny bed. At the far end was a tiny door. I guess that must be to a toilet or something. There were filthy clothes everywhere. There were nasty dishes in the sink and the counter as well. I didn't figure the smell was coming from the clothes or the dishes though. I thought it was coming from the toilet area. I guess that made sense why that would smell. I knew I shouldn't open the door, but my curiosity drew me towards it. I slowly approached it with my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't expect to find anything, but the unknown is so frightening. I heard a noise behind me and turned to see Jim step into the trailer. He was put off by the smell as well, but admitted his curiosity had gotten the better of him. I turned back to the door and slowly pulled the latch. Yeah, there was a small toilet inside, but that wasn't what was causing the smell. Instead, there was a decaying corpse in the bathroom. I almost felt like vomiting. I slammed the door shut, leaning against the wall for a moment. I heard Jim frantically calling my name around me. I turned around and saw him holding his Swiss Army knife. "That's my knife," Jim said. I asked him where he'd found it. It was laying on the counter apparently. He showed it to me and showed me the engraving on it as well, so we knew this had to be his. We put 2 and 2 together and realized somebody must have stolen it from his pack last night. Whoever that person was had brought it back to this trailer. And whoever lived in this trailer apparently lived with a corpse in his bathroom. We hurried and got out of there as quick as possible. We hustled. We didn't set up camp that night. Instead, we kept going the entire way. We were half dead when we got back to the house the following morning, but after that experience, we knew there was no way we would have gotten any sleep anyway. When I was about 13, my family moved to a different state. We were one of those families that moved around a lot. We didn't even stay at this place very long, a year at the most. I really liked this house though. There was a brick ranch on top of the hill. The yard itself was huge, maybe a whole acre or so. Had an old shed, an old doghouse, and some fruit trees as well as a garden, and we really liked it. The yard was fenced in with barbed wire, and there were miles and miles of forest surrounding it. I'll admit right off the bat that I'm more of an indoors sort of guy. But we didn't have cable, and this was before the days of internet. TV reception was very poor as well, so I took to exploring the woods surrounding the area. I used to find all sorts of things, depending on which direction I went in. There were old abandoned barns, other structures, huge fields even. It was all depending on how far I was willing to hike. Several times I'd gotten shocked by electric fences. I had to wonder why they were so far out in the woods like that. A couple of months out from arriving there, I was out exploring when I came across an old trail. It was a little bit but not completely overgrown, so I decided to follow along it and see what I came across. After a short time, I noticed I was coming upon a clearing. As I got closer to it, I was a bit startled to notice it seemed to be a small cemetery of some sort. It was overgrown with moss, vines, grass, and leaves, but it was definitely a cemetery. There were about 20 grave markers. None of them were neat gravestones like you'd see in a regular graveyard. Instead, there were stick crosses and stones with what looked like writing on them. I guess this is the sort of thing I should have found frightening, but I've always liked scary stuff. I was very fascinated by what I'd found. A few of the rocks had writing on them, but they were quite difficult to read. The first few words were always blurry, but eventually I was able to make out a name on one of them, Annette something. I thought it must have been like a cat name or something. The graves were far too small to be for people. I figured I had stumbled upon a pet cemetery. When I got to the third stone I could read though, my heart froze in my chest. It was the first one that I could make out all the words. Right then, I realized what this cemetery actually was. It read, "Future grave of Kimberly, killed in her sleep." I was able to read a couple more of them. On each one of them, it seemed to be a future grave of someone and listed the way that they would be killed. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. Of course, I was freaked out, but I didn't want to leave right away either. I read a few more, then decided to get the hell out of there. It was a few months later on TV. It gives me chills to this very day. A man whose name I will not give out was denied parole. He had been arrested for the murders of 2 women. Their names were Kimberly and Antoinette. I immediately remembered that graveyard. I wondered if this was the same guy who'd made that graveyard. I wondered if he hadn't been caught. How many more people had he been planning on killing? There were about 20 graves there already, and who knows if he would have ever stopped if he arrived at that number. I've only had one really scary thing ever happen to me, but it sure was a doozy. It happened when I was doing some off-trail hiking. One of my hobbies is exploring abandoned buildings, abandoned mines, and things like that. There was an old abandoned mine I had heard about. I had been wanting to check it out for a while. I delayed it though because it was going to be quite the long hike to get there. I finally got some time to do so and decided to go and check it out. It was a late 19th century mine, so I had always been worried about it collapsing or something. Mostly, I was worried it would be difficult to find. I was able to get a map from another explorer online though, who said he had already been there. There was a trail I had to follow for quite a while, but the quickest way to get to my destination was to go off that trail. In fact, the map I had received told me to go off at a certain point. I was pretty fortunate not to get lost. At one point though, I heard some noises and saw some movement off in the distance as well. I got quiet, hoping to see a deer or something. However, what I saw instead was a man who was walking towards the trail. He was a pretty big man too, like a biker, wearing denim with multiple patches on it. He had to be about 6'6". I don't even want to take a guess on his weight. Normally when hiking, if I see another hiker, I'll make contact with them to be friendly, but there was something about this guy that really freaked me out. He seemed to be very out of place here. Instead, I crouched down and waited until he was already gone. I went on my way, and it was probably a good 2 more hours before I made it to the mine. I was very excited. Outside the mine entrance, there was a crumbling old building. It was gray and made of rotted wood. I was very curious about it, but I decided to check out the mine before I did that. The mine itself was pretty fascinating, but only if you're really into that sort of thing. I spent some time exploring it, then set off to go back. On the way out, I remembered I had wanted to check out that building outside. I was a bit concerned too, because it looked like it could crumble apart at any moment. If I decided it was too unstable, I could just take a simple look inside, then leave immediately. I opened the door and almost immediately fell over in shock. There was a teenage girl in the shack. She was cuffed to an old stove and gagged as well. I was way too freaked out at first to know what to do, but then I realized I had to go ungag her immediately. She started panicking, telling me she'd been abducted nearly a week ago. It had happened as she was leaving a biker bar. Honestly, I didn't stop to think that it was weird a teenager would be in a biker bar to begin with. Anyhow, the guy knocked her out and brought her to this old building. She begged me to help her get free, and of course I did so. I searched through my belongings and found something to pick her handcuffs. They were single lock cuffs, so I was able to free her after some considerable effort. Of course, she was still panicked and did her best to run out of the building right away. I was able to calm her down a bit, enough to ask her when the guy who kidnapped her was last there. She said it had been about 5 hours earlier. She then described the man to me, and I realized it was that same big guy I'd seen earlier. I told her he seemed to be sticking to the trail, and I knew a different way to get out of the area off trail. I knew she had gone through a horrible experience and was terrified that she would have to be as quiet as possible. She told me she understood, but as we left, I had to keep slowing her down, telling her it was essential we remain as quiet as possible. I kept worrying that when we got back to the place where I went off trail, we would run into the guy right there. I kept a firm lookout for the man, hoping to see him passing us towards the mine, so we knew we'd have more time to get away. I didn't see him anywhere at all though. We were moving for about an hour before we got back to my car. When we did, there was already a pickup truck parked right next to it. The lady, whose name I won't reveal, told me it was that man's truck. I had to assume the guy was either around or he'd gone back to the shack and we'd just missed him. I hurried her into my car and drove her right to the police station. The biker guy was arrested soon after. It turns out he'd grabbed her in order to blackmail her dad to get some money from him. I don't know how that all turned out in the end, but I do know the guy went to jail and the girl returned home safely in the end. I heard it one night and it quite startled me. I was laying in bed just reading a book. I began drifting off slightly when I started to hear a strange knocking on the floor. Needless to say, I was a bit surprised. I tried to calm myself down a bit. We lived in a really old house, so it wasn't unusual to hear all sorts of noises in the night. I went back to reading my book. Just a few minutes later, though, I heard more knocking on the floor. This time, I noticed something that really scared me though. It was a rhythmic sound. That worried me because it made me believe the knocking noise was being made by a person. I was extremely scared and was also 16 years old at the time. I was the only person in the home who had a bedroom on the bottom floor. I wasn't going to go into the basement and check it out by myself. However, I also wasn't willing to go and get my parents up either. Instead, I sort of just curled up in my bed in fear and slapped some earplugs in my ears. I read a little bit more, and until I went to bed, I convinced myself that it was all in my imagination. The following day, I told my parents I thought there might be a ghost or something in the house. They sort of made fun of me a little bit, and when I explained what I had heard, the response was immediately dismissive. They told me the noise I was hearing was likely just the house settling, and that if it bothered me so much, I should just put my earplugs in and ignore it completely. The following night, it happened again though. Again, I heard some knocking on the floor of my bedroom. And again, the knocking was rhythmic. I put my earplugs in my ears like I was told to, but that didn't really solve the problem at all. Yeah, it did cut out the noise, but just getting rid of the symptoms doesn't cure the disease. I no longer heard the knocking, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. My parents were probably right. The knocking was likely just the house settling, but it still bugged me. I didn't mention that it happened again to my parents the next day. I really wanted to, but they were both very matter-of-fact people, and I knew what their response would be right away. Instead, I kept it all to myself. The following night, I was staying up reading a book again. This time when it happened though, I decided to go check out the basement myself. Yeah, stupid, I know, but I really had to go down there and see what was tormenting me so much. I got up and went over to the basement door. I stood in front of it for a few moments, then opened it. The light to our basement was at the bottom of the stairs. I began quietly walking down them like any scared child or teenager would do. I felt really stupid as I took my time walking down the stairs. Each step I took going down, I thought about changing my mind and running back up and shutting the door. I didn't though in the end. Our house was really nice but much older, which is why the house settling argument made sense in my head. The reason I tell you about this now, however, is because as I was walking down those steps, each and every one made a really large creak. It made me nervous, thinking about whatever might be in the basement, becoming aware that someone was coming down the stairs. That would just make it so much more likely that I was going to get grabbed or something. When I got about halfway down the steps, I heard the knocking sound start up once again. It startled me, and I actually tripped over my own feet. I fell down the remaining stairs and hit with a really hard bump. Then I heard something drop, and I knew someone was definitely down in the basement. All of a sudden, something hit me in the back of the head and knocked me silly. It didn't completely knock me out though. I heard someone running across the room. I could see their form in the meter light coming from the basement door. He flung open the door to the outside, sprinted out, and that was the last thing I remembered. My dad rushed down the steps and turned on the lights soon after. We called the cops, but nothing came of it. I never heard the knocking again either. I guess that means the guy never came back, but I had no idea what he was doing down there in the basement for so long anyway. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do subscribe, be sure to hit that bell button and turn notifications to all so you can be notified whenever I post a new video. I try to post every night, so if you don't feel like doing that, you can come back and check every night around 5:30 p.m. and there should be a video for you. If you guys have any criticism or any thoughts on the stories therein or anything like that, please be sure to leave a comment. I always make sure to read every comment. Even though I can't always respond to them, I do read each and every one and I do enjoy them, so please continue to leave your guys' comments. If you'd like to send in your own story for me to read, please be sure to check in the description below the video. It will have links to my Twitter, Gmail, and Facebook accounts. Send me a message on any of those and I'll try to read your story as soon as possible. If you do decide to send a story in, please be sure to include the tagline, what the name of the story is, what the type of the story is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. And of course, there's a link to my friend Killer Orange Cat's channel in the description. He lets me use some of his stories in my videos, so if you could be so kind, please be sure to check him out as well, as he's also a good scary story narrator. Overall though guys, I think that's pretty much it for now, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.